When the US dollar collapses, the world won't break slowly, it will break all at once. And 5 countries will feel the shock before anyone else, triggering a chain reaction that could reshape the global economy forever. In today's deep dive, we travel across continents, inside unstable economies, broken political systems, and fragile financial networks to uncover the 5 nations most at risk. When the dollar finally falls, for more than 70 years, the US dollar has been the engine that powers almost every major economy on Earth, from oil to international banking, global trade to foreign reserves. Almost everything depends on the stability of the dollar. But in a world drowning in debt, rising inflation, collapsing trust, and increasing geopolitical tension, the question is no longer if the dollar will fall, but when. And when that day comes, not all countries will suffer equally. Some will adapt, some will survive, but a few nations already dealing with unstable currencies, corrupt institutions, and heavy dependence on American dollars will face a level of chaos the modern world has rarely seen. We begin our journey with the first country on the list, one whose fate is tied to U.S. currency more tightly than almost any other nation alive today. Country 1: Lebanon, a nation already on its knees. Lebanon has been in a financial nightmare for years. Its banks froze people's savings. Its currency collapsed by more than 90%, and millions of citizens watched their life savings evaporate. But what most people don't know is that Lebanon is deeply dependent on U.S. dollars to survive. In fact, almost every major transaction, imports, medical supplies, international payments relies on the American currency. When the dollar falls, Lebanon won't just face another crisis. It will face a total collapse of what's left of its financial system. Imagine daily life when imported goods, fuel, grain, medicine can no longer be paid for. Imagine a government that already can't afford electricity, trying to keep the country running in a world where dollars are suddenly worthless. Lebanon's collapse wouldn't be gradual. It would be immediate and heartbreaking. Now, we travel thousands of miles southeast to a country the world has watched fall over and over again. Country 2: Sri Lanka. A collapse waiting to repeat. Sri Lanka shocked the world in 2022 when it became the first major country in this century to run out of money. Fuel lines stretched for miles, inflation skyrocketed, the government fell, and the military was deployed inside cities just to maintain order. But one detail matters most. Sri Lanka also relies heavily on US dollars to import nearly everything: energy, food, machinery, and raw materials. Right now, the country is trying to rebuild, but its economy sits on foreign loans, IMF rescue packages, and a mountain of debt, much of it tied to the value of the US dollar. If the dollar collapses, Sri Lanka instantly loses the ability to repay loans, buy essential imports, or stabilize its currency. The chaos we saw in 2022 would look small compared to what comes next, because this time, the collapse would not be caused by Sri Lanka alone, but by the global financial system breaking around it. And this brings us to the third country, one far larger, far more populated, and facing a far more dangerous storm. Country 3: Egypt, the silent giant in deep trouble. Egypt has 110 million people, one of the largest populations in the Middle East and Africa. It relies almost entirely on imported food, especially wheat, and nearly all of that trade is priced in US dollars. Over the last few years, Egypt's currency has crashed repeatedly, food prices have soared, and international investors have fled. But what truly makes Egypt vulnerable is its enormous dollar-denominated debt. When the US dollar falls, Egypt faces a terrifying paradox. The cost of imports becomes unpredictable, global lenders panic, and the country already struggling with inflation loses access to foreign reserves. A nation this large facing a financial collapse would create a humanitarian crisis the world hasn't seen since the 1970s, and its location surrounded by unstable neighbors would magnify the shock. But if Egypt is a giant in trouble, the next country on our list is a superpower pretending to be stronger than it truly is. Country 4: Turkey, a modern power with a fragile core. Turkey is one of the most strategically important nations on Earth. It sits between Europe and Asia. It controls access to the Mediterranean, and it has one of the largest militaries in NATO. But behind the curtain, Turkey has lived through repeated currency collapses, waves of inflation, and a central bank forced to defend the lira with everything it has. Turkey's corporations owe billions of dollars in foreign currency debt. Its banks depend heavily on global capital markets, and its economy, though large, is extremely sensitive to the value of the US dollar. When the dollar falls globally, nations begin to panic, investors flee, markets freeze, and countries like Turkey, which rely on external borrowing, suddenly face enormous instability. A collapse here would shake financial markets across Europe and the Middle East. It would not be contained, but none of this compares to the fifth and final country, the one most dependent on the US dollar, the one whose entire economy is built on borrowed time. Country 5, El Salvador, the most dollar-dependent nation on earth. El Salvador doesn't just use dollars. It literally replaced its own currency with the US dollar. This means its government, banks, loans, salaries, savings, everything is tied directly to the fate of the American currency. If the dollar collapses, El Salvador loses its financial identity overnight. Its banks would freeze, its economy would seize up, and its government, already struggling with debt, would face impossible challenges. The country bet its entire future on the strength of the US dollar. If that strength disappears, so does the foundation of its entire financial system. But what comes after the collapse? What happens in the world when these countries fall? When the dollar collapses, nations around the world won't collapse equally. Some will adapt, some will fight, some will find new trading alliances. But for these 5 countries, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Turkey, and El Salvador, the fall of the dollar represents an existential crisis, a moment where food, fuel, medicine, and international trade may become nearly impossible, a world where decades of progress can vanish in weeks, and the scariest part, no one knows when the collapse will happen. But every day, the signs grow stronger. The fall of the dollar may not happen tomorrow. It may not even happen this decade. But history teaches us that every empire, every currency, and every system eventually reaches a breaking point. What matters is who is prepared and who is not. If you want a deeper look into which nations will rise when the dollar falls, which currencies might replace it, and what ordinary people can do to protect themselves from a global financial crisis, make sure to subscribe and watch our next episode.